For nearly 4 decades, the Burmese python has ruled the Everglades without a single natural check. No alligator, no panther, no bird of prey ever evolved a defense against it, because nothing in this ecosystem had ever needed one. But something has finally turned against the python, and it isn't the animal anyone expected. It's not a bigger predator or a smarter trap. It's a killer the python brought with it, and a native snake that might be the only thing built to survive it. The Burmese python is not native to Florida. It arrived through the exotic pet trade, escaping or being released into the wild starting in the 1980s and 1990s. And by the time wildlife officials understood what was happening, the snake was already breeding freely across South Florida. According to the National Wildlife Federation, more than 18,000 pythons have been captured in the state since the 1990s alone, and the true wild population is thought to run into the tens of thousands. What made the python so devastating wasn't size or aggression. It was novelty. Every native predator in the Everglades, alligators, panthers, bobcats, hawks, evolved over thousands of years to recognize specific threats and specific prey. The python didn't fit any of those categories. It simply moved in, and nothing knew what to do with it. Studies tracking mammal populations in python-heavy areas of the park have recorded raccoon, opossum, rabbit, and deer sightings collapsing by well over 90% in some regions, a level of ecological disruption rarely documented from a single invasive species. There have been scattered acts of resistance. Alligators have been photographed dragging smaller pythons underwater. Florida panthers, of which fewer than 200 remain in the wild, have been recorded on trail cameras stalking pythons for long stretches before striking. Bobcats have hauled off python carcasses, and in one widely reported case, raided a python nest to eat the eggs. But these are individual animals improvising in the moment, not a population adapting a strategy. With so few panthers left and no species capable of breeding a hunting instinct into an entire generation, none of this pressure has ever been enough to slow the invasion. That has been the ceiling on python control for 20 years. Plenty of isolated victories, no systemic one. The first real crack in the python's dominance didn't come from a predator at all. It came from something researchers noticed in snakes that had nothing to do with pythons. Beginning in the early 2010s, biologists across Florida started finding native snakes, black racers, coach whips, pygmy rattlesnakes, and others, in a condition that didn't match any known illness. The animals were thin, weak, and often found gasping in the open, behavior that healthy snakes almost never display. When researchers began examining the bodies, they found the cause packed into the airway. Pale, thread-like parasites crowding the lungs, trachea, and mouth, in some cases spilling out visibly. Melissa Miller, an invasion ecologist affiliated with the University of Florida, first identified an infected native snake back in 2012 and eventually traced the parasite's origin to the Burmese python, which had carried it into the state from Asia decades earlier. The parasite is called Rillietiella orientalis, though it's more commonly known as the snake lungworm. Despite the name, it isn't a worm at all. It's a small crustacean-like organism in a group called pentastamids, and Stetson University biologist Terence Farrell has compared its feeding behavior to that of a leech, drawing blood from inside the host's respiratory tract. In its native range across Southeast Asia, the lungworm has coexisted with the Burmese python for a very long time, long enough for host and parasite to reach a kind of biological truce. The python's body tolerates a manageable parasite load. The parasite, in turn, doesn't kill the animal it depends on to survive. That balance took an enormous stretch of evolutionary time to build. When pythons were transported into Florida, they carried the parasite with them. But none of that history came along. Native Florida snakes, with no shared evolutionary past with this organism, had no tolerance for it at all. What turned this from a troubling side effect into a genuine ecological crisis is how the lungworm spreads. It doesn't require direct contact between a python and a native snake. Infected snakes shed the parasite's eggs in their waste. Insects and other small invertebrates pick up those eggs. Amphibians and reptiles that eat those insects become infected in turn, and snakes that eat those smaller animals complete the cycle. Every link in that chain is a completely ordinary part of how the Everglades already functioned, which is exactly why almost no one saw it coming. Jenna Palmisano, a University of Central Florida researcher who founded the Snake Lungworm Alliance and Monitoring Network, SLAM, in 2022 to track the parasite spread, has helped confirm just how far it has already traveled. Peer-reviewed surveillance work, including a case study published in Frontiers in Veterinary Science, documented the lungworm in Alachua County in north central Florida, hundreds of miles from where Burmese pythons are established, and well outside the python's own invasive range. More recent tracking efforts by SLAM and independent researchers have found the parasite in well over a dozen Florida counties, with at least 17 to nineneen native snake species confirmed infected, spanning species as different as banded water snakes, cottonmouths, and the federally protected eastern indigo snake. That geographic gap is the detail that unsettled scientists the most. The python's range is still largely confined to South Florida, held there partly by its dependence on wetland habitat. The lungworm has no such restriction. It has built a fully self-sustaining transmission cycle running entirely through Florida's native insects, amphibians, and snakes, with no python required at any point in the chain. Remove every python from a state tomorrow, and the lungworm would still be here, spreading on its own schedule through a landscape that never developed any defense against it. The python opened the door. The parasite no longer needs it to stay open. If the lungworm represents the invasion's most insidious consequence, the eastern indigo snake represents the most hopeful counter to it, though the two stories are now dangerously intertwined. The eastern indigo, dry marching couperi, is the longest native snake in North America, capable of exceeding 6 feet in length, with glossy black scales that show an iridescent blue-purple sheen in direct sunlight. It is also a snake that specializes in eating other snakes, including venomous species. Indigo snakes are functionally resistant to the venom of North American pit vipers, allowing them to prey on rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths that would kill almost any other predator. On the forest floor, a full-grown indigo has essentially no natural rival, which is why biologists have long referred to it as a keystone predator of the longleaf pine ecosystem. For most of the last half-century, though, that predator was functionally gone from a huge stretch of its former range. As Florida's longleaf pine forests were cleared, farmed, and fragmented, and as gopher tortoises, whose burrows indigo snakes depend on for shelter, declined alongside them, the eastern indigo vanished from northern Florida. It was formally listed as federally threatened in 1978, and by the early 1980s, it had disappeared entirely from sites like the Alachua Bluffs and ravines preserved in the Florida Panhandle, where it hadn't been seen since 1982. Bringing it back required rebuilding its entire habitat first. Starting in 2017, the Nature Conservancy, the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and a coalition of other partners began a long-term reintroduction effort at the Alachua Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, raising captive-bred indigo snakes for roughly 2 years before releasing them into restored sandhill habitat. The work depended on years of prescribed burning and longleaf pine restoration to make the land viable again for both the snakes and the tortoises whose burrows they need. The turning point came in autumn 2023, when biologists monitoring the preserve documented 2 wild-born hatchlings, the first evidence in more than 7 years of releases that the reintroduced population was breeding entirely on its own in the wild. It was a milestone conservationists had been waiting on since the program began, proof that this wasn't just a population of survivors being propped up by captive breeding, but a population capable of sustaining itself. By 2025, the program had released well over 200 snakes at the preserve, with additional reintroduction. Efforts underway at Conecuh National Forest in southern Alabama, and biologists have since documented healthy, full-sized adults establishing themselves in the restored landscape. The eastern indigo's role as a snake-eating predator raises an obvious question. Could it be the animal that finally puts real pressure on the python invasion? The honest answer, according to the researchers closest to this work, is a qualified maybe. A juvenile or subadult python, up to roughly 1.5 meters long, falls well within the size range an adult indigo can subdue and consume, the same way it already handles large, dangerous native snakes. That matters more than it might first appear, because a predator that consistently removes young pythons attacks the invasion before those individuals ever mature into breeding adults, a form of pressure the Everglades' existing predators, limited by small numbers and no ability to pass on a learned hunting strategy at scale, have never been able to provide. Unlike an alligator or a panther, an indigo population that successfully reproduces in the wild can, in principle, grow and spread that pressure across a landscape over time. Against a full-grown adult female python, which can reach well over 4 meters and approach 90 kilograms, that confidence disappears. No documented case exists of an indigo snake taking on a python of that size, and researchers are candid that they simply don't know whether it's possible. There's a second complication, and it's the one that makes this less a rescue story than a race. The eastern indigo snake has already been confirmed among the native species susceptible to the very same lungworm parasite the pythons introduced. The indigo's resistance is specific to pit viper venom, a completely different biological mechanism, and there's no evidence it offers any protection against a respiratory parasite. As the lungworm continues its documented spread northward through Florida, and as the reintroduced indigo population works to establish itself in that same northern range, the two are, geographically, moving toward each other. If the parasite reaches the recovering indigo population before that population is large and genetically robust enough to absorb the loss, the one predator most capable of pressuring young pythons over time could be weakened by the same organism the pythons brought into the state in the first place. Even as this race plays out, the pythons themselves are not staying still. Genetic surveys of pythons captured across South Florida have identified individuals carrying DNA from the Indian python, a closely related species also introduced through the pet trade, indicating the two have interbred in the wild. That matters ecologically because pure Burmese pythons are strongly tied to wetland habitat, a preference that has effectively confined the invasion to South Florida's swamps for decades. Indian pythons favor drier, higher terrain. A hybrid population inheriting tolerance for both habitat types could, in theory, expand beyond the wetland boundary that has functioned as a natural containment line for the entire invasion. Pull back from the individual threads, and the picture that emerges is more complicated than a simple story of nature striking back. The Burmese python did not just prey on native wildlife directly. It imported a parasite that has since become self-sustaining, spreading independently of the species that introduced it and killing native snakes across a range far larger than the python's own. At the same time, one of the few native predators capable of meaningfully preying on juvenile pythons is finally recovering after decades of absence. But that recovery is racing against the same invisible threat. In the broader history of invasive species management, a full eradication of an established large invader has essentially never happened. What tends to happen instead is a new equilibrium, a reorganized ecosystem running on a different set of relationships than the one that existed before the invasion began. Whether that new equilibrium in the Everglades ends up including a python population held meaningfully in check by a recovering native predator, or one still expanding largely unopposed while native snake communities absorb an ongoing